everybody. Welcome to Real Mob Stories. This is your host, James Proctor. And today we're going to talk about who I consider one of the mob's most fascinating characters. And we're going to talk about Carmine Persico. And when I think about him, you have this guy that's both intelligent and ruthless. And although physically he's a small guy, Carmine had balls. He didn't take crap off anyone, and he wasn't a guy you wanted to mess with. He ends up being elevated to boss of the Colombo crime family, but spends most of his reign behind bars. And today we're going to visit some of the most fascinating parts of Carmine Persico's life. So, going back to the beginning, Carmine was born in 1933. He grew up in Carroll Gardens in the Red Hook areas of Brooklyn. And you got to understand that in the 30s and 40s, when he was brought up, that the United States had gone from being in the Great Depression to being in World War II. And this area of Red Hook became very important, both economically and also for the Italian community as a whole. So you had a lot of Italians that worked on the docks. So you had a lot of dock work that was going on. You had a lot of businesses that were there supporting the dock work. The unions were controlled by the mob. And so this was this gritty, mob infested area. And, basically the Mangano and Profaci family controlled everything. If you need a job, you could go to the mob. They would help you get work. If you were Italian and you had the right connections, you might not have to pay anything. But if you didn't have the right connections, you paid money to get your job with the unions. And these guys that worked on the unions, they loved to gamble. They loved to get a drink after work. And so you had bars, you had this nightlife that surrounded the Red Hook area. So Carmine Persico, he has two brothers that got in the mob as well with him. You had Theodore, also known as Teddy, and then you had Alphonse, who was known as Alley Boy Persico, not to be confused with Carmine's son, Lil Alley Boy Persico. So Carmine grew up, he got in a lot of trouble growing up. And he joined a gang. He was part of the South Brooklyn Boys. The Garfield Boys was kind of a gang that was part of this whole South Brooklyn Boys area. And what we notice about Carmine is that he's a natural leader, but he's violent. When he was 17 years old, he kills someone for the first time. He gets in an argument with a fellow gang member in Prospect Park, and he kills the guy. Charges end up getting dropped. But the neighborhood wise guys at the time, they saw this kid Carmine, that he had balls. He's willing to do what it takes. And you finally had a Profaci guy named Frank Abadamarco that brought him under his wing. And Frank was an old timer. He had been around for a while. He was out of Brooklyn, and most of his crew was around bookmaking, loan sharking. They did hijackings and burglaries, and he put Carmine Persico right into the middle of all that. So Carmine was making money. He was willing to do what it takes. He would listen to Frank. And during this time, he also, talking about Carmine, became friends with the Gallo brothers, Albert and Larry Gallo. They were also close to Frank. And so they controlled a lot of that area, around President Street and the Red Hook area. Like I said, they were a lot of knockaround guys. There's a lot of guys that just was doing more of these street level activities. They weren't necessarily making a lot of money, but they were doing okay. And one thing I do want to mention that you hear a lot of people that talk about how the Gallo brothers and Carmine Persico took part in the Albert Anastasia murder. And that's not true at all. That was done by Gambino's, Carlo Gambino's guys. This was more of an internal issue that was going on with the Gambino family. They had, or with the Mangano family or Anastasia family at the time, but they had permission from the commission to do that hit, but it had nothing to do with with the gallows, didn't have anything to do with Carmine Persico. But the thing was that you started having these problems between the gallows and Profaci. Joseph Profaci, the boss, he's this greedy old bastard that's been in power since 1930s. He was the original boss of the Profaci family. He made a lot of money. He had ventured in also into legitimate work. He had an olive oil company, which he was known for. He was involved in real estate. The guy was wealthy, but he was also very demanding. He taxed his guys, and a lot of the guys, especially these young Turks like the gallows, they didn't like the guy. They weren't getting shit, and they were tired of that. And it got to a point where they were asking for new rackets that would be more profitable, and Profaci wouldn't ever give it to them. And it just continued to be a problem. And eventually, Marco said, just screw the old man. And they said, we're not going to take this shit anymore, and we're not going to pay him. We're not going to pay the taxes. And the thing was, that was a bold move, but it wasn't a good move because Profaci was still in charge. And even though he was up in age, he still had power, and he couldn't let this disrespect go. And so that was the last straw. And Frank ends up getting killed by Profaci's guys, and this really upset the gallows. It upset everyone that was around there. And you had Carmine Persico that was with the gallows, and they said, we are going to go to war against Profaci. We're not going to listen to him anymore. We're going to do our own thing. And then they decide that they're going to kidnap, of all things, the administration of the Profaci family. And, this war now, it was violent. This war was something that didn't go the gallows way. You see, Joey Gallo, he was all for killing the administration. He said, we just need to get rid of these guys. We don't need them. We can do without it. We can be our own thing. But his brother, Larry, who was more of the reasonable one, Larry was the guy that I would say would be the smartest of the gallows. And he said, no, we can't do that. We don't have the commission's approval. We're always going to have to be looking over our head. We have to find a way to get past this. Let's negotiate. Let's see what we can get. Maybe Profaci, the old man, will have a little bit of heart and forgive and give us a break. And that's what they decided to do. Profaci made promises. They said, hey, we will give you better rackets. You're not going to have to be taxed as much. But as soon as he got out, they think things went back to the same. So at some point, Joe Profaci is able to reach out to Carmine Persico and is able to convince him to change sides, to betray the gallows. He makes promises. He said, you're going to get wealth. You're going to move up in this family, but you need to just stick by me. And he made that decision. Also, just letting you know, the Gallo crew or the Gallo brothers and Persico himself, they got made right before the books were closed in 1957. But what we're talking about right now is in the early 1960s. So anyway, eventually, let's fast forward a couple of months, and Carmine Persico and a friend of his, another guy named Sally D'Ambrosio, they run across Larry Gallo there in an East Flatbush club called the Sahara Club. And they decide to strangle Larry. Larry's fighting for his life. Larry was being choked. It wasn't looking good for him. And they had a rope around his neck. They were pushing it in and everything. And then all of a sudden, a police officer just happens to walk by at that very moment. He notices something going on inside the building. I don't know if the door was was open or just unlocked, but it was unlocked. He walks in, he intervenes in it, and Gallo survives. But if you look at pictures of Larry Gallo, you'll see the rope burns around his neck, and he was just moments from death. And so at this point, the Gallos and Carmine Persico, they're bitter enemies, and Carmine gets the nickname the Snake. So Joe Colombo takes over with the permission of the commission. Colombo became friends with Carlo Gambino. He also warned about plots that were taking place against the commission, and so they give Joe Colombo the spot as boss. In early 1963, Persico himself survived a car bombing. He had a guy named Hugh McIntosh that was this huge guy, probably 6'4", 6'5", weighed 300 pounds. He was the main enforcer for Carmine Persico. If you see the photo of them together, which I'll show, you'll see that Carmine's like half the size of Hugh McIntosh. But anyway, Persico survives the car bombing. Hugh McIntosh actually gets shot in the nuts in this attempt to kill Larry Gallo. And then later, Gallo gunmen actually ambush Persico there in Brooklyn, and he gets shot in the face, hand, and shoulder. And we're told that Persico reportedly spat out the bullet that had entered his face. But what ended the war, at least the first war in the 60s, wasn't so much one side beat the other. It's basically the Gallos went to prison, Carmine Persico went to prison. Joe Colombo was able to kind of bring the family together, at least for a few years. So let's fast forward. So Persico again gets into trouble. He just cannot stay out of prison. He's in and out of prison pretty much from the time that he was 20 years old. But what happened is that he gets out in 1968, and because of his loyalty, Joe Colombo promotes him to captain. And so Persico has his own crew at this time, and they're doing well. They're involved in a lot of labor racketeering. They're involved in extortions, loan sharking, hijacking, illegal gambling, most of your normal stuff that you'd expect from a street crew. But he just can't stay out of trouble. In 1972, he gets back in prison again, and he would have to spend another 8 years in prison. And kind of during this time, you had Joe Colombo get shot. Joe Colombo eventually dies in 1978. The family's run by Tom DeBella. And DeBella was an old school guy, pretty quiet. He had worked a lot actually there in Red Hook. He knew the docks and all that, and he brought some stability to the family. But it was always the plan that when Carmine Persico got out of prison, he would be the boss. The Persico regime, he was young. He was young when he got out. He wasn't even 50 years old, and he was the boss. So it looked like that this guy was going to be on top of the world for a long time. But like I said, he just can't stay out of trouble. He does stupid stuff. He tried to bribe an IRS agent back in 1978 while he was in federal custody. He had offered the agent $250,000 for getting him an early release from prison. And there's no way that would even work. And Persico ends up getting sentenced to 5 years in prison. And then we see that in 1984, Persico and the rest of the Colombo family leadership get caught up on what's called the Colombo trial. And this is a case where they start using RICO. And this happened before the commission trial of 1985, but Persico was aware that something was going to happen. And so he goes into hiding. And in fact, the FBI put Persico on the 10 most wanted list. But Persico, Carmine didn't leave or did not stay too far away. He actually went to Hempstead, New York, which was on Long Island. And he was staying with his brother-in-law, Fred DeChristopher. And the problem is, something Persico didn't know is that DeChristopher had become an informant. He had actually been an informant for 2 years after getting caught up in this sting operation. So they knew exactly where Carmine Persico was, but they didn't arrest him because they were wanting to get more evidence. And so during this time, Persico would have people call him. He had people visit him. And so the feds were able to just get more and more information. And eventually he gets arrested. So let's fast forward to 1985 now. And he gets caught up in the commission trial. So Persico, along with 11 other New York mob leaders, get caught up in the Mafia Commission trial. And you had people from all of the 5 families. You had like Tony Ducks Corallo. He was caught up in it. You had even Jerry Lang with the Colombo family. You had Rusty Rastelli originally as part of the Bonanno family. Then he gets separated from it eventually. But you had all of these different family members that get caught up. Fat Tony Salerno, he's kind of the main guy. At the time, the government's thinking that he really was the boss of the Genovese family. They didn't realize he was just the front boss for Cien Gigante. So Carmine Persico decides he's going to be his own lawyer. And this was a surprise. And it didn't do him well with the other defendants on trial. The problem is that Persico's not a lawyer. They felt that he would F up their own case, right? They were concerned that he wasn't experienced, he wasn't competent. Persico, he went with it. He felt that because of his own history of being involved in trials over the years, that he could defend himself better than any other attorney. Was this arrogance? Yeah. Was it a bad decision? That's a great question, because I don't think it would have made a difference. Carmine Persico was going to go to prison for the rest of his life, regardless. But the thing was, it didn't do him any favors with the rest of the family. And the one thing about this trial I wanted to mention that was a little bit unusual. For the first time ever, you had mafia bosses, you had the defense team actually acknowledge the existence of the mafia. And no one had ever thought that would even be possible. But the thing is that normally in most of these trials, what the prosecutors do, they spend time trying to prove that, yes, there is a mafia, and yes, these people are part of it. And so the defense was saying, well, what we need to do is just say, yes, we're part of the mafia, but the thing is just because you're part of the mafia doesn't mean that you're a criminal. And so that was the take that was the way they were taking it, because what they were wanting to prove to the jury was that they themselves did not know of the crimes that were taking place with what was beneath them. But the whole idea of RICO was that boss and administration could be held accountable for the crimes that the people underneath them was involved with. And that's exactly what happened. And all of the guys got 100 years in prison for what they did. Carmine actually did a good job. According to the judge, according to people that followed the trial, Carmine Persico actually was pretty competent. He actually had a good strategy, because what he was trying to do was actually befriend the jury. He wanted the jury to see him as a human being, as someone that wasn't this monster. He made jokes. He was kind of self-deprecating about himself, and so he was kind of this folksy like guy. And what was kind of different with Carmine was that, unlike all these other guys that were on trial with him, Carmine wasn't ever on tape. They never heard Carmine Persico's voice. And so, of all these guys that got picked up, it was actually Carmine Persico probably had a better chance of getting out. And so he goes to prison, and he decides he wants to stay in charge. His plan is that he wants his son, Alley Boy Persico, to actually become the boss. But even Alley Boy can't stay out of prison. And so you have Persico that's running the family through through acting bosses, through these ruling panels, and it's just not working out. To me, what once Persico knew that he was going to be in prison for the rest of his life, he should have stepped down as boss. That would have been the right decision for the family, but he didn't do that. And because of that one decision of staying in power, it destroyed the Colombo family. It led to the war in 1991 that killed over 12 guys. It led to the family being in disarray. And it was, to me, a big mistake. Carmine Persico just wanted to stay in control. He had a taste of power he didn't want to let go. And what's amazing is that he remains officially a boss until the day he died in 2019. And he was the boss for nearly 40 years. And during that period of time, he was only on the street for maybe 3 years. But Carmine Persico, definitely a tough guy. Carmine Persico was definitely a smart guy in many ways. But in my opinion, he made a bad decision not stepping down, and the Colombo family paid for it.